Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Mirza Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Reish Chav Tes Amid Aleph. We pick up today 2 lines off the bottom on Reish Chav Ches Amid Beis. In the middle of the line, Siman Shin Samachei Sif Daled. Our learning today should be a schos for Achenu Beis Yisrael Hanusunu Batzara Bashivya Haimdim Bein Bayamo Bein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yitzia Mitzar Lervacha Be'Afelu La'Ira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagala V'Zman Kariv Ne'Mar Amen. Our learning should be a schos Refuah Shalema for Meir V'Rabi Reb Shalom Ruvain ben Shimon for Achia Gadol ben Shemeir ben Esther Fradel Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha Rivka Bashir Leah Chavadasa Basrezel Serel and Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana. They should all have a refuah shalema b'soshar chayei Yisrael. So, moving along here to Siman Shin Samachei Sif Daled, an interesting discussion. So, we've been talking a lot about a mavui. So we have this alleyway. It's mukaf mechitzais on 3 sides. Midaraisa, this is a rishus hayachid. However, the Chazal required a tikkun. The Chazal required that we do something at the open 4th side of the mavui, either to act as a heker, as a reminder of the difference between the mavui and the rishus harabim. So one should not come to confuse a mavui, which is a thoroughfare that a lot of people use to get to their chatzeros, and the rishus harabim. People are going to see that you're allowed to carry inside the mavui. It's a rishus hayachid. They might come to get confused and think that you could carry in rishus harabim. So Chazal required this tikkun, either a kaira, a crossbeam over the top of the mavui, or a lechi, a side post at the side of the opening, to serve as a heker, as a sign, and as a reminder that there's a difference between the mavui and the rishus harabim. Or it could be that it acts actually as a mechitza, as something that actually halachically closes off the 4th side of the mavui. We have discussed many times, it could be that this question of whether it's a heker or a mechitza pertains to the kaira, but not to the lechi. The lechi is definitely mishum mechitza, be that as it may. This is the situation that we're dealing with. We have this mavui, it has a lechi, or it has a kaira. Now, we've discussed previously the size of the kaira. How wide does that kaira have to be? It doesn't have to be very wide at all. How wide does the lechi have to be? The lechi could be a kolshu. The lechi could be very, very thin. But the lechi also has a maximum size. We learned that the maximum size of the lechi is dalet amos. If you put up a very, very, very large board at the side of the opening of the mavui, if you put up something that's larger than dalet amos, it ceases to be a lechi. Now it becomes a kaisel. Now it becomes part and parcel of the wall of the mavui. It's not considered a lechi anymore. Point that I want to bring out is that a lechi could be quite wide. Why is that significant to Sif Daled? Because the question that we're going to deal with here in Sif Daled is, what is the status of the area at the opening of the mavui that is either underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi? We know that inside the mavui, once you have a proper tikkun at the Pesach HaMavui, you're allowed to carry inside the mavui. But when we say inside the mavui, what does that mean? Does that mean until the outer edge of the lechi or the outer edge of the kaira, where it abuts against the rishus harabim? Or does it mean the inner edge of the lechi or the kaira? That's why I mentioned the fact that a lechi could be quite large, because theoretically, we could be dealing with a sizable area over here that's a gray area. What's the halacha of this area alongside the lechi? Do you have to stop carrying at the inner edge of the lechi? Or can you carry all the way to the outer edge of the lechi? That's the question that we're going to discuss over here. Now, the truth is that this question is a matter of dispute, and it's a matter of great discussion near the beginning of Masechtas Eruvin. There's a whole sugya that discusses this shaila. And we're not going to go through the whole sugya, but what it boils down to over here is, we have a machlokes. Are you allowed to carry alongside the lechi underneath the kaira or not? There are shittas that say yes, there are shittas that say no. The Gemara tries to understand what lies behind the machlokes. And the Gemara really comes down to two different ways of understanding this. We could say that everybody holds that the Korah is there to act as a hecker. The question is, who is that hecker for? When we say that the Korah is a reminder and a sign to remind people of the difference between the Mavui and the Rishus HaRabim, who are we talking about? It's a sign for who? Is it a sign for the people inside the Mavui, or is it a sign for the people outside in the Rishus HaRabim? And that has great significance to our question over here. If the hecker is for the people outside in the Rishus HaRabim, then it's the outer edge of the Korah that serves as the hecker. If it's the outer edge of the Korah that serves as a hecker, so that it makes sense that you're allowed to carry until the outer edge of the Korah. If the Korah serves as a hecker for the people inside the Mavui, then it makes sense to say that it's the inner edge of the Korah that serves as a hecker. Well, in that case, you have to stop carrying when you get up to the inner edge. And it could be that that's the subject of the machlokes over here. Well, which, is it a hecker for the people inside, or is it a hecker for the people outside? The Gemara then says, no, it could be everybody agrees that the Korah actually makes a mechitza that blocks off the fourth wall. But again, we have a machlokes. Is it the inner edge of the Korah that forms the mechitza, or is it the outer edge that forms the mechitza? And again, if it's the inner edge that forms the mechitza, well, then you have to stop carrying when you get to the inner edge of the Korah. If it's the outer edge of the Korah that makes the mechitza, well, then you can carry up into the outer edge. Now, obviously, this is very complex because, like I said at the outset of this year, everybody seems to hold that a lechi is not a hecker. A lechi is a mechitza. So how does this play into this? Machlokes, fine. It's a whole sugya in the beginning of Masechtas Eruvin. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of the backdrop, the background over here of why the area that's under the Korah and why the area that's alongside the lechi is sort of a gray area, and that's why we have Shin Samachay Sif Dalid to discuss what's the halacha. Are you allowed to carry there, or are you not allowed to carry there? Says the Mechaber, Mutter lehishtamesh tachas haKorah. The answer is, the psak halacha is, you're allowed to be metaltal underneath the Korah, u'keneged alechi, and you're allowed to be metaltal alongside the lechi. Okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Chafei, Keneged Alechi, recited Larmar. What the Mechaber wants to say is, Bein shetikun amavi b'Korah oy b'lechi, whether you will misakin this mavui using a lechi, using a side post, or using a Korah, using a crossbeam, mutar lehishtamish kenegdam. In both cases, you're allowed to carry in that area. You're allowed to carry in the area underneath the Korah. You're allowed to carry in the area alongside the lechi. Mihu. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, Yesh paiskim, there are paiskim, the Seivrim, who hold, Dafka kishezeh hamokoim shekeneged alechi, lo yihaya boy kisher arba tvachim al arba tvachim. When is this the halacha that you're allowed to carry alongside the lechi or underneath the Korah? That's only when that area is very small. How small? It's less than daled al daled. Why? Because daled al daled, as we've said many times, is the minimum size of a mokim choshev. So what? The oz batal legabe pnim. If the area alongside the lechi or underneath the Korah is less than daled al daled, it's not a mokim choshev. If it's not a mokim choshev, we're going to say it's bottled to the inside of the mavui. And then you're allowed to carry underneath the Korah or alongside the lechi. And likewise, you would be allowed to pick up a chayfetz underneath the Korah or alongside the lechi and transfer it to the inside of the mavui. Because if it's less than daled al daled, then that area is completely bottled to the inside of the mavui, and it has exactly the same din as the inside of the mavui. Aval, however, according to these poskim, kisheyesh bazeh shetach arba al arba. But if this area under the Korah or alongside the lechi is daled al daled tvachim, the choshken yoser, certainly if it's larger, in that case it's a mokum choshev. And then nechshav ze hamokum kekarmelis, then that area gets the status of a karmelis. Le'inyan, in the context of she'asel otaltal boy rak toich arba amos, now it has the din of a karmelis, And inside that area, you would not be allowed to be metaltal more than Dalet Amos. So too, you wouldn't be allowed to transfer from that area out to the Rishus Harabim, or to bring it into the Mavli, into the Rishus HaYachid, also because it becomes a Carmelis. Now, why would it become a Carmelis? It seems that the reason it becomes a Carmelis, without getting too deep into the Sugya and Erevin, it seems that the reason it becomes a Carmelis is because, like I tried to give you the flavor from the Sugya in Erevin, this area is a bit of a gray area, right? And what's a Carmelis? A Carmelis is a gray area. Remember what we said all the way at the beginning of Chelik Dalet. Carmelis is a contraction of Rach Umol. It's not hard, it's not soft. It's a gray area, a Carmelis. Well, this area is a bit of a gray area. We don't know exactly how to look at it. The entire Mavui Midaraisa is a Rishus HaYachid. It's Mukaf Gimel Mechitzos. Okay, Chazal said it requires a tikkun, so you made a tikkun. But this area underneath the Kaira or alongside the Lechi, we don't know which edge of the Lechi or which edge of the Kaira is the primary edge. We don't know whether it's Mechitza, whether it's Heker. We don't know. Inner edge, outer edge. So this area, Rachumal, we don't know exactly what it is. So if the area is less than Dalet al Dalet, no, it's bottled to the rest of the Mavli. But if it's a Mokum Choshev, now we have to give it a status on its own. Once we have to define it and we have to give it a status on its own, according to these poskim at least, we're going to call it a Carmelis, and now you're not allowed to be Metaltal Yosef Dalet, and you can't transfer in either direction. Not into the Mavoi, that's the Rishus HaYachid. Not out of the Mavoi, that's the Rishus HaRabim. Either way, Carmelis to Rishus HaYachid, Carmelis to Rishus HaRabim, either one is an Issa D'Rabbanan. So you wouldn't be allowed to do that. But v'yesh poskim she'ein mechalkin bazeh, but there are poskim who disagree, and they don't make a difference between whether it's a makom chashuv or not a makom chashuv. They go with the psak over here of the mechaber, mutter lehistamish tachas hakaru keneged alechi, and they don't differentiate based on the size. V'yesh poskim she'ein mechalkin bazeh, v'sayvrim da'afilu yesh by arba al arba, gam kein bottle legabe pnim. These other poskim hold that this area is always bottle to the interior of the Mavli. Now we go to the next piece of Sif Daled, which is really fascinating because it seems to be very counterintuitive. We're saying right now that it's mutter to be mishtamish under the kaira or alongside the lechi. Okay, now says the mechaber, however, Vahani Mili, bottom line of the Shulchan Aruch, Reish Chav Chesed Beis, Vahani Mili, when do you have this heter? B'pasuach l'rishus harabim. You have this heter to be metaltal underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi when the mavoi opens up onto a bona fide rishus harabim. Aval b'pasuach l'karmelis. But if the mavoi opens up onto a karmelis, which is only rishus d'Rabbanan, aser, then you have to be machmir. Then you're not allowed to be mishtamish under the kaira or alongside the lechi. Bein tachas hakaira ubein keneged halechi. Now again, this seems to be very counterintuitive, right? Let's just do the math over here. If you have a mavoi that opens up to a rishus harabim, well then midaraisa, the interior of the mavoi is a rishus hayachid, and outside the mavoi is a rishus harabim. To go from a rishus hayachid to a rishus harabim is a daraisa, right? So that is very chomor. If the mavli opens up onto a karmelis, so then the interior of the mavli is a rishus hayachid, outside the mavli is a karmelis, transferring from the mavli to outside the mavli is an issa d'Rabbanan. Obviously, the first case is much more chomer than the second case. Yet, the mechaber is telling us, this shaila, the status, alongside the lechi, is more kal, it's more lenient, if you're dealing with the mavli rishus hayachid and outside of rishus harabim. That's more lenient than if you're dealing with a mavli that opens up to a karmelis. If it opens up onto a karmelis, we have to be machmir, and then you're not allowed to be mishtamish underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi. Sounds very counterintuitive. Explains the mechaber where he's coming from. Says the mechaber in the top line, Reish Chav Tes Amud Aleph, mipnei shemitztaref lekarmelis she'etzloi. The reason is, because like I tried to emphasize to you, this area under the kaira or alongside the lechi is this gray area. We don't know how to deal with it. And therefore, it is very similar to being a karmelis. And if that's a karmelis, and outside the mavui is a karmelis, well then, this is a concept that we've already had earlier. Now the area under the lechi, under the kaira, or alongside the lechi, is going to join the karmelis that's outside the mavui, shemotza mines minoi v'neyar, because this gray area found a first cousin. It found a karmelis right next to it. So it's going to be swept up by that karmelis. It's no longer going to be bottled to the inside of the mavui. If outside the karmelis is a rishus, if outside the mavui is a rishus harabim, well then we look at the interior of the mavui, rishus hayachid. We look at outside the mavui, rishus harabim. Now we look at this gray area underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi. It certainly isn't a rishus harabim. It's not a mokaim hiluch harabim, 16 amas wide, a mokaim hiluch shishim ribu. It's certainly not a rishus harabim. So we're not going to allow it to be swept up by the rishus harabim. Instead, we're going to be mavatalit to the interior of the mavui. We're going to be mavatalit to the rest of the rishus hayachid. But if outside the mavui is a karmelis, well, now the area alongside the lechi or under the kaira is much more similar to the karmelis outside. It will be swept up by the karmelis, and we will give it the din of a karmelis. Now, the bir halacha, before we even see the Mishnah Berurah, I want to point out a bir halacha. Bir halacha says over here on Reish Chav Tes Amud Aleph, bir halacha dibur hamaschil b'pnei shemitztarif lekarmelis etzloi. If we do the math here, we could come up with a very dangerous mistake. And that is, we could say, oh, so if outside the mavui is a karmelis, so then under the kaira is a karmelis, alongside the lechi is a karmelis, it joins the karmelis outside. Well, in that case, what if there's a chayfetz laying on the ground alongside the lechi or under the kaira? You should be allowed to pick it up and transfer it out to the rishus harabim. Dangerous, says the bir halacha mikol makom le'inyan lo yitziyah lechutz efshar da'aser. To transfer a chayfetz from under the kaira or alongside the lechi, the bir halacha says it would seem that would be aser. Dimin HaTorah rishus hayachidu, because very dangerous. It's very possible that underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi really is a rishus hayachid daraisa, because it's still mukaf gimel mechitzos, right? When you're under the kaira, you're still within the side walls of the mavui. And so you got two walls, and you got the back wall of the mavui, so it's mukaf gimel b'chitzos. How would you be allowed to take from there to rishus harabim? That l'chayra, or to a karmelis. If the outside of the mavui is a karmelis, you can't transfer from a rishus hayachid to a karmelis. That would be the sidrabanan, right? So we're going to say matzah min esminoi v'neyar l'chumra, but we're not going to say matzah min esminoi v'neyar l'kula. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Back on Reish Chav Ches Amud Beis, Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Chavav. Avo b'pasuach l'karmelis, but if the mavui opens up onto a karmelis, then you don't have this heter to carry underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, afagav de ba'armal karmelis kilmi rishus harabim, even though always a karmelis is more lenient than a rishus harabim, mikamakom l'inyan zeh amrina matzah min esmina v'neyar. But in our case, we're going to say matzah min esmina v'neyar, pirush, the karmelis shebein l'chayayim, this area alongside the lechi or underneath the kaira, afim lo yhaya b'shir karmelis b'tchila, even though it's not big enough to be a karmelis, shalo yhaya arba al arba tvachim, even if it's less than daled al daled, matzah min esminoi shachutzalai, it now becomes very similar to the karmelis outside the mavui, v'neyer mishanasai, and it wakes up from its sleep, v'neschazek, and it becomes strengthened as a karmelis, lehitztarif l'karmelis shebetzidai, to be swept up and to join with the karmelis alongside it outside. V'shem karmelis alav, and now it becomes known as a karmelis. V'asa lehishtamesh tachtav, and now it would be also to be metaltal yosef b'dalad amas underneath the kaira. or alongside the lechi, the gam lachnisay lefnim, or to transfer an object from there into the interior of the mavli, which is the rishus hayachid. Masha ein kein bepasuach l'rishus harabim. But if the mavli opens up onto a rishus harabim, shehu ein minay klal, there's no similarity between the area alongside the lechi or under the kaira to the rishus harabim. Ein mitzaref imay, it's not going to join what's outside of it. Ubatal lagabe pnim, instead it will be batal to the interior of the mavli. Ois katan chavzayin. Bein tachas hakora ubesefer el yerabba mitzadid lahakel. The El Yerabba takes the position that we could be makel over here, lehishtamesh tachas hakora, and you could be metaltal underneath the kaira, afilu pasuach lakamelis, even if it opens up onto a karmelis. So the El Yerabba is saying not like the mechaber, v'chein pasak b'sefer even ha'oizer, u'beprat im ha'kaira rechava arba tvachim. Certainly, if you're dealing with a kaira, an overhead crossbeam, and the kaira is rechava arba tvachim, you're talking about a wide kaira, 4 tfachim wide, 14 inches, 16 inches, ubriya lekabel ma'aziva, and it's a strong enough kaira that it could serve as a beam to support a roof, bevadai mutter afilu pasuach lekamelis, then it's definitely mutter to carry underneath that kaira, even if the mavli opens up onto a karmelis. Why? Because if you're talking about such a significant crossbeam, then we would apply the halacha l'moshe misinai of pitikra yared v'saisim, the chashiva mechitza. Then that kaira is making a bona fide mechitza dropping down across the opening of the mavli, and then certainly it would be from the outer edge of the kaira, and you would be allowed to carry underneath the kaira. Moving along to Sif Hey, end of the top line, Reish Chav Tes Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber. Afal pi shemuter lehishtamesh tachas hakora, even though we just paskined that you're allowed to carry underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi, very interesting halacha. Lo yeshev adam b'roish hamavli v'chevetz biyadai. So somebody wants to pull up a lawn chair, and he wants to go all the way to the edge of the mavli. He wants to go, we just paskined, that you're allowed to carry until the outer edge of the kaira or the outer edge of the lechi. He wants to pull up a lawn chair all the way at the opening of the mavli, and he wants to sit there being mavisedra. Ava pishamuta lehishtamesh tachas hakara lo yeshev adam b'roish hamavli v'chevetz biyadai. Don't sit all the way at the open edge of the mavli with a sefer in your hand. Why? Shemi is galgal ha'chevetz biyadai l'rishus harabim, because you're playing with fire. Maybe you're going to drop whatever is in your hand, and it's going to land outside in the Rishus Harabim. V'yeviyenu love. And then you'll pick it up from the Rishus Harabim, and you'll bring it into the Mavli. Rishus Harabim to Rishus Hayachid. It's a Daraisa. If it's a Karmelis, it's a Darabanan. Kevin she'ein heker beinoi l'Rishus Harabim. And the reason why we're concerned about this is because if you're sitting all the way at the opening of the Mavli, while Chazal were misakin that you have to be misakein, a mavli, using a kaira or a lechi, it's not a heavy-duty heker. In the world of hekerim in Hilchas Erevin, the heker of a kaira, the heker of a lechi, is considered somewhat of a minor heker, as opposed to a chotzer. We said that you have a chotzer that's opened, if it's opened less than 10 amas. You also need to be misakein the opening of a chotzer. But a chotzer needs a more significant tikkun. A chotzer needs either a lechi on each side, not one lechi. It needs 2 lechayayim, and you can't do it with a kaira. You can't be, or it needs a pas arba on one side. It needs a significant board on one side. So the opening of a chotzer needs a much more heavy duty and a much more significant heker. The heker of a mavli, so to speak, is a minor heker. And therefore we're concerned, if you're sitting mamish at the end, so first of all, where's the kaira? The kaira is mamish at top of your head. When you're sitting like this, looking forward, and you're being mavisedra, and you drop your sefer, when you look, you don't see the kaira. The kaira is at 12 o'clock. It's over your head, right? So you're not going to see it. The lechi, if you're all the way at the opening of the mavli, where's the lechi? The lechi's at a 90-degree angle. It's at 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock. You don't see it unless you turn your head all the way. So you don't have a clear heker. If you drop something out to the Rishus Harabim, you might very easily come to transfer it back into the Mavli. So says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do this. It's a D'Rabbanan. Don't sit all the way at the end of the Mavli holding a Chayfetz. Aval al Pesach HaChotzer, but if you're dealing with the opening of a Chotzer, mutter, then it would be mutter to sit there with a Chayfetz b'yadai Bein Pasuach l'Rishus Harabim, whether the chutzner is open to a Rishus Harabim, Bein Pasuach l'Kamelis, or whether the chutzner opens up onto a Kamelis. Why? Sheyesh by Hekera, because since you need a much more significant heker, you're going to have a Pas Dalid, or you're going to have Tula Chayayim, or you're going to have a Tzuras HaPesach, then we say that you have a significant heker. We're not afraid that you're going to goof up. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kol Chav Ches, Afal Pi Shemutar Lehishtamish. Return and learn what the Mechaber means to say is the Dafka al Tzad HaMikre v'HaHistamein Mutar L'Taltel Shom Chafotzav L'Eis HaTzorech. When we pass it here in Sif Daled that you're allowed to be metaltal underneath the kaira or alongside the lechi, that's only when it's happenstance. Al Tzad HaMikre v'HaHistamein, or it just happened to happen that you're right next to the lechi, you're underneath the kaira. Then mutal l'taltel sham kafetz of leis hatzorech. Aval lo yeshiv sham b'kvius v'chevetz b'yadai. Don't set up your lawn chair all the way at the edge of the mavoi and go sit there b'kvius to go be mavisedra. Even though the Mechaber couches this halacha in the context of takas hakora, it also applies to alongside the lechi. But the Chavetz Chaim does say that it could be, if the opening of the mavli would be mesukin with a real tzuras haPesach, maybe that's more significant, and then it would be muter. Umiyu. B'tzuras haPesach shalanu, and this is the geya to us. Umiyu b'tzuras haPesach shalanu. When we're dealing with our style of tzuras haPesach, shegavoya ma'oid, which very often is very, very high. I mean, I check the Erev in my community over here in Staten Island, and a lot of the tzuras haPesachs that we are soimach on are telephone poles and wires. And sometimes those wires are 20 feet in the air. Sometimes they're higher than that. We have areas by the train, etc., with sometimes we're using a lechi down at the bottom of a pole to catch wires that are way up high. So it doesn't look like it's Tzuras HaPesach. It doesn't feel like it's Tzuras HaPesach. You don't notice it. You're not going to have a heker. Bevadai Osir. Then the Chavetz Chaim says it certainly would be Osir to sit all the way at the edge of the Tzuras HaPesach. The less Kera, because you don't have a heker. So this is a halacha to keep in mind when you have one of these like private eruvin at the yard, at the opening of a yard. Don't sit all the way at the edge with a chayfetz b'yadai if it's not a very easily recognizable Tzuras HaPesach. The Mishnah Berurah is couching this halacha in the context of a very high Tzuras HaPesach. I dare say, if it's a normal, so to speak, Tzuras HaPesach, what is it, 8 feet tall? I think those are very noticeable. Even if you're dealing with what we deal with nowadays, remember, when we make an Erev, inside the Erev is a Rishos HaYachid. What's outside the Erev? Outside the Erev is a Karmelis. We don't make an Erev in a bona fide Rishos Harabim, right? We don't do that. We only make a Reuven by a Karmelis. So inside the Erev, Rishos HaYachid, Mukaf Mechitzais. Outside the Erev, Karmelis. The Isser D'Rabbanan to sit at the edge of the Erev is a Chshasha D'Rabbanan. We're afraid that you're going to forget yourself and do what? Transfer from Rishos HaYachid to a Karmelis, which is an Isser D'Rabbanan. So it's almost like a double D'Rabbanan, right? The whole Erev is there so to prevent doing an Isser D'Rabbanan, transferring from Rishos HaYachid to a Karmelis. We're telling you not to sit at the edge of the Erev. We're making an Isser D'Rabbanan not to sit at the edge of the Erev to protect against an Isser D'Rabbanan. Still in all, the Mishnah Berurah says, doesn't matter. This halacha still pertains. Because the Magen Avraham says it's too common to goof up and make a mistake. Moving along to Sivav, 4 lines down, middle of the line, says the Mechaber. Nashim hayoshvais al Pesach hamovli, women who aren't necessarily aware of this halacha, and they think there's an Erev, and they go and they sit all the way at the edge of the Erev. The kadeyan biyadon, and they have a jug in their hand. So they go out with their water bottle, and they sit all the way at the edge of the Erev. Says the Mechaber, ein memachin biyadon, you should not go object and protest against what they're doing. Tekeven demidi d'Rabbanan, because since this is an Isser D'Rabbanan, they're not being over an Isser D'Oraisa by sitting over there. So this is Rabbanon to sit over there, lest they drop something. So this is Rabbanon. Mutav shiyu shagigais v'loy mezidais. We therefore apply the rule, mutav shiyu shagigais. It's better. They don't know. They're not b'shat nefesh being over Nisa Rabbanon. They're ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. It's a shaygig. And better that they should do it b'shaygig than you should go tell them that what they're doing is wrong. And they're going to say, what are you talking about? I'm inside the Erev. What's the problem? And they're not going to listen to you. And then they're doing it b'mezid. You told them that it's wrong, and they're not listening. So better don't tell them. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kat Lamed, a very important thing. Demidi d'Rabbanan. Truth is, the Mishnah Berurah says, Va'afilu b'midi d'Oraisa. Even when it comes to Misurei d'Oraisa, we sometimes apply the rule, Mutav shiyu shagigos v'loy mezidos. Iyadinan shelo yishbu lanu. If you see somebody being over in Issa d'Oraisa, but you know that if you go tell him that he's doing something that's usher, he's not going to listen. Ein loy melehen. You don't tell them that what they're doing is wrong. Unless they're doing something that's mamish spelled out in Torah Shebiksav. If they're doing something that it says in the Torah Beferish that you're not allowed to do, then you tell them, even if they're not going to listen. Why? Because we don't believe that they're a shoygig. You see, if you go tell somebody, oh, you're not allowed to sit at the edge of the Erev, that's an Issa D'Rabbanan, right? It's something that you have to have learned something. You have to be a little bit of a learned person to understand such a concept and to have heard of such a concept. So that means if they're sitting at the edge of the Erev, they're doing a shoygig. But if you see somebody doing something that's mamish spelled out in a pasuk that you're not allowed to do, then we assume that they're already amazed. We don't assume that what they're doing is b'shoigig. They have to know what it says in the Torah, what's spelled out b'ferish. Kidalakaman b'simin tafresh ches sif beis ayin sham. Says the Mechaber Sif Zayin. Mavli shenitlu kairoisav oilechoyav b'Shabbos. Okay. You have this mavli that needs a kaira or a lechi. It's an issa d'Rabbanan to be metaltal in the mavli without the kaira or a lechi. So you have this mavli that's musukin with a kaira or a lechi, and now the kaira or the lechi fell down on Shabbos. So I just want you to realize that even though this halacha is put down here in Sif Zayin in the context of a mavli, and we don't tend to think of our Erevin in the context of a mavui, right? We don't look at our streets and our avenues as being a mavui. We look at them as being streets, right? So sometimes we learn these halachas of a mavui, and we don't feel that they're so negayah to us. But realize what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a mavui that's mukaf gimel b'chitzos, where midaraisa you're allowed to carry. Chazal said, midarabanan you're not allowed to carry. In order to make it mutter to carry, you need an Erev. Okay, let's say we live in a community where our streets are not bona fide Rishus HaRabbins. So what are they? They're a Carmelis. If they're a Carmelis, midaraisa, you're allowed to carry in them. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan that you're not allowed to carry in them. What do you need to do to obviate that Issa D'Rabbanan? You need to put up an Erev. So really, our Erevin are very similar to the need for a tikkun of a mavli. So the halakha over here of Sif Zayin would apply equally to our Erevin. Says the Mechaber, Mavli shenitlu karaisav el chayayav b'Shabbos. If you have a mavli that had a proper kaira or a proper lechi, so now it's mutter to carry inside the mavli, right? And now the kaira or the lechi fell down on Shabbos. So if you have an Erev, and your Erev came down on Shabbos, the same halacha. Says the Mechaber, even though at the outset of Shabbos it was mutter to carry in the mavli because it had a lechi or a kaira, or in our cases, even though at the outset of Shabbos it was mutter to carry in the community because you had a proper Erev, right? But now the Erev fell down on Shabbos, or the kaira or the lechi of the mavli fell down on Shabbos. Aser misham ve'elech, once it falls down, it's also to carry. Bein pasuach l'rishus harabim, bein pasuach l'kamelis. Whether the mavli opens to a Rishus HaRabim or the mavli opens to a Kabbalist. Doesn't matter. Either way, it is D'Rabbanan to carry, without the kaira, without the lechi. So too, our streets, it's D'Rabbanan to carry, without a proper Erev. When Shabbos started, you had an Erev, but the Erev fell down. Now you don't have an Erev. Now it becomes Aser. You're not allowed to carry. Says the Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat Lamed Aleph. Shenitlu Kairoisav Oilechayav. The Mishnah Berurah is bothered by the Lashon Rabim over here. Kairoisav means it's multiple kairos. It's multiple crossbeams. Lechayav means it's multiple lechis. Now, a Mavi doesn't need multiple kairos. A Mavi doesn't need multiple lechis. It needs one lechi or one kaira. So, what does the Mechaber mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, he means it's lechi or it's kaira. Why does it say kairoisav or lechayav? He's talking about multiple mavuyos. Same halacha applies to our eruvin that are made out of tzuras haPesachs. How do we make an eruv, Rabbi say? We put up tzuras haPesachs, right? 2 telephone poles, wire, 2 lechis to catch the wires, right? That's how we make an eruv, with multiple tzuras haPesachs. If the tzuras haPesach falls down, your eruv is batal, mikanu la'aba. For the rest of Shabbos, you're not allowed to carry. You wouldn't be allowed to carry from the house outside. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we're not going to say over here that since Shabbos started beheter, it remains mutter. We had an application of this in Siman Shin Samach. In Shin Samach, we spoke about people who were traveling, and they were out in the Bika. They were out in the rolling plains of grain, and they're stuck there for Shabbos. Midrabanan, you're not allowed to carry. You're in a Kamalis. So they're making an encampment. And we spoke there about the halacha of somebody who only is able to make mechitzais geruais. He could only make halachically flimsy mechitzais. So, for instance, he's using limud, he's putting up posts, and he's using limud, but he's using shesi below erev. He's using vertical posts without any horizontal posts. So he's making mechitzais geruais. We said that there's a maximum size. One person who's stuck out in the Bika could only make an encampment of a certain maximum size. 2 people, also a certain maximum size. But once you have 3 people, you become a shayara. You become a caravan. Once you become a shayara, you're allowed to encompass an area however large you need. You can encompass an area using a mechitza grua. So then we had a case. What happens if at the beginning of Shabbos you had 3 people? Since you had 3 people, you made a large encampment. On Shabbos, one of them died. Now you only have 2 people. 2 people have a maximum size. You made an encampment larger than the maximum size for 2 people, because you had 3 people. We said that over there, the 2 people get the large encampment for the rest of Shabbos. Since they started Shabbos beheter to use the larger size, they could use the larger size for the entire Shabbos. So there we had an application of Shabbos came to hutra. Once Shabbos started beheter, the heter continues for the entire Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we don't apply that over here. We don't say, you had an erev at the beginning of Shabbos, gave it hutra. It becomes mutter for the rest of Shabbos. Why? What's the difference? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. I'll tell you what the difference is. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the difference is hoyel v'les nehu lamachitzais. The last 3 words of Eis Kat Lamed Beis. Over there, in that case in Shin Samach, you have mechitzais, right? You encircled an area with mechitzas. So when the person died, the mechitzas weren't removed. It's just a din derabanan that 2 people only get to encompass a certain size. Lamaisa, when the guy died, it still is encircled with mechitzas. Over here, when the erev falls down, the mechitzas are gone. We can't say Shabbos gave hutra. Shabbos started beheter because you had an area that was encircled by mechitzas. Now you don't, because your erev is gone. So the heter goes away. Okay, let's go weiter over here in Sif Zayin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines off the bottom, middle of the line. Says the Mechaber, V'yesh mi she'omer. But there are those that say, Dahani mili be'ir she'enu mukefes chayma. When we say that if the tikkun hamavi fell down on Shabbos, or if the erev fell down on Shabbos, now you can't use it anymore. That's when you're in a city that's not surrounded by a wall. Avol be'ir mukefes chayma. If you're in a city that is surrounded by a wall, mutter, then it's mutter, even if the tikkun hamavi fell down, or even if the erev fell down. Why? Because you're in a city that's mukaf chayma. If you're in a city that's mukaf chayma, so the entire city is a Rishus HaYachid. Now, you'll ask me the question, hold it. If you're in an ear that's Mukav Chaima, why did you have an Erev in the first place? Right? So the Mishnah Berurah is going to tackle this. Explains the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, Ois Cotton Lamid Gimel. Mukefes Chaima Mutter. If you're in a city that's surrounded by a wall, then even if the Erev or the Tikkun Mavi fell down, it's still mutter to carry. Taharei al Yedei HaChaima have you call it Rishus HaYachid Gamur. Because the entire city is Rishus HaYachid. It's Mukaf Mechitzos. So, okay, the Erev fell down. The Tzuz HaPesach fell down. So what? The Tikkun Mavi fell down. So what? Well, that begs the question, why did you have the Erev, why did you have the Tzuz HaPesach or the Tikkun Mavi in the first place? So the Mishnah Berurah explains why you had it. The Tikkun Mavi lo yhaya ela kedei l'salek de yurei hanochrin me aleihen. Oh. And this is very important for people to have the proper understanding of our Erevin nowadays. So pick any Jewish community that you want, right? You go ahead and you put up an Erev. You make Tzuz HaPesachs, you have your telephone poles, your wires, your lechis, your posts, everything else. You make a proper Erev around the community. What did you just accomplish? Remember, it's a misnomer when we call those strings and lechis and wires an Erev. They're not an Erev. They're mechitzos. You're making Tzuz HaPesachs, those create mechitzos. They create partitions. So when you put up your Erev, what are you doing? You're surrounding an area, and you're making it a Rishus HaYachid. Now, what kind of Rishus HaYachid is it? Oh, it's a Rishus HaYachid that serves many, many, many multiple entities. Inside this large Rishus HaYachid, you have a bunch of separate Rishuyos HaYachid. I have a house, my neighbor has a house, the next one has a house. What's the halacha when you have a chotzer? It's surrounded by mechitzos, and you have multiple residents inside the chotzer. You need iruvei chatzeros. You have to join everybody in an iruv chatzeros. Otherwise, you're not allowed to carry outside in the street. You're not allowed to transfer from the houses to the street, from the street to the houses, right? It's a drabanan. You need an iruv chatzeros. That's the eruv, Rabbi say. The strings and the posts and the telephone poles are not an eruv. They're mechitzos. Once you put up the mechitzos, now the Rav, or whoever it is, has to go make it a Ruvei Chatzeros and join everybody in a Ruvei Chatzeros. But here's the rub. What do you do when you live in Staten Island, or any other community, take a pick, where there's Yidden and Goyim? So you joined all your Yidden together in a Ruvei Chatzeros. But what about Tony and Vinny and Vito and everybody else? They can't join in your Ruvei Chatzeros. We don't join Einam Yehudim in a Ruvei Chatzeros. So now we still have a big Rishus HaYachid that's servicing multiple entities. All of the Yidden joined in one entity through the Erev Chatzeros. But you've got Tony and Vinny and everybody else. What do you do with them? So the way we solve that problem nowadays is we get Rishus from the government. We say that the government, the municipal government, has a yad over every property inside the Erev, and we get Rishus from them to incorporate them inside a Rishus HaYachid. We'll learn those halachas later, when we learn the halacha of a Ruvei Chatzeros, that we could be kind of Rishus from the Einam Yehudim. We do that through the municipal governments. That's what we do, right? But back then, they didn't have that eitzah. The governments weren't friendly. They weren't ready to be masker Rishus to the Yidden so that they could incorporate them into the Ruvei Chatzeros. So what did they do? Tell you what they did. What they did was they made their big Rishus HaYachid with an Erev, or they had their big city that was surrounded by a wall, so the inside is a Rishus HaYachid, and then they carved out the Jewish areas to separate them from the Goyish areas, so that they could create an area where the Yidden could incorporate into the Ruvei Chatzeros without Goyim. So the only reason they had Tzuz HaPesachs, or they had Tikkun Mavuyos inside the city that was Mukav Chaima, was not to create mechitzos to encompass the Yiddish area. That they already had. It's already a Rishus HaYachid from the wall of the city. But what they needed the mechitzos for was to carve out the Einam Yehudim. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah explains over here. The Mishnah Berurah says, this Yesh Misha Omer, that says that when the Erev falls down, or the tikkun mavui falls down, it's also for the rest of Shabbos. That's only if you're dealing with a city that's not mukaf chayma. But if you're dealing with a city that's mukaf chayma, so really it's a Rosh Hashanah daraisa. So why do you have an eruv? To carve out the goyim. All right, that fell down during Shabbos. You're still allowed to carry. Why? Because you still have your mechitzos. You still have the wall around the city. What don't you have? You have an eruv chatzeros problem. That eruv chatzeros problem, once Shabbos started beheter, we keep the heter for the entire Shabbos, and the Mishnah Berurah explains why. Therefore, even if the tikkun mavli that's carving out the Einim Yehudim falls down on Shabbos, mutter. Why? The heavy, because this halacha would be akin to another halacha. Let's say you have two chatzeros next to each other that did not make it a eruv chatzeros. You know why they didn't make it a eruv chatzeros? Because you didn't need one. I always tell you, when we talk about a eruv chatzeros, I'm always going to use my example of bungalow colonies. So you have bungalow colony A, bungalow colony B that are right next to each other. But there's a solid wall between them. And there's no door in the wall. And there's no windows in the wall. Do they have to make it a eruv chatzeros? No! They're not joined together. They're two completely independent chatzeros. So before Shabbos, they didn't make it a eruv chatzeros because they don't need one. But then Shabbos afternoon, the wall between them fell down. Now that the wall between them fell down, they're joined. Now they needed a eruv chatzeros. So do they become aser in the middle of Shabbos? When the wall falls down, do they now aser on each other? No. The halacha is they don't, because since Shabbos started beheter, it remains beheter. It's like two chatzeros that didn't join in the eruv chatzeros because they didn't need one, because they had a wall separating them. And the wall fell down. The Amrinon over there we say Shabbos hoyel v'hutra hutra. Why? Because if bungalow colony A had a wall around it, bungalow colony B had a wall around it, when the wall between them falls down, bungalow colony A and bungalow colony B are still surrounded by an outside wall. So they're still a Rosh Hashanah daraisa. The only reason you wouldn't be allowed to carry is because now they needed a eruv chatzeros. But when Shabbos started, they didn't need a eruv chatzeros. So over there we say hoyel v'hutra hutra. In our case of the city that's mukaf chayma, and the only reason they had a Reuven inside the city, or tikkunim avois inside the city, was to carve out the Einim Yehudim, well, when they fell down, the city is still mukaf chayma. It's still Rosh Hashanah daraisa. Then we say Shabbos hoyel v'hutra hutra. Because of a Taz, however, the Taz does point out something. Dafka Yoshva ulabasayv hukva. This halacha would only be true by a city where first the city became inhabited and then they built walls around it. So it's hukaf ledira. It's a real Rosh Hashanah. Kistama yari shalanu, which we assume is usually the way cities are built. Does have a Rosh Hashanah. Avalim hukva lebasayf yashva. But if you have a city where first they put up walls and then they built the houses, that's not hukaf ledira. Teyeshaleh din karmelis b'drabanan. Remember, you're dealing with an area bigger than 5,000 square amas. The wall went up first and then they built the houses. It's not hukaf ledira. Then the interior of that city, midaraisa is a Rosh Hashanah, but midrabanan is a karmelis. V'asu tikkun b'mavli lahatra tiltal v'nafal atikun. Now, if you put up a Reuven inside that city, or tikkun mavli inside that city, and it fell down on Shabbos, aser, because now you don't have the outside mechitzos, because the outside mechitzos are invalid. It wasn't hukaf ledira. Taharei mechzera bechitzta upasuach lekarmelis. Now let's just see the Ramah. Says the Ramah, 4 lines off the bottom. Hagav yesh lismay chazeh ulahatir. You could be saimach on this yesh mishaimer that says if you're dealing with a city that's mukaf chayma, if the tikkun mavli, the eruv falls down, you're still allowed to carry. V'chol zeh shoyiroi lamed kol Shabbos, but that's only if the eruv was well made, or the tikkun mavli was well made, and it was roi to stand for Shabbos. Avalim hoya oimed lisaseh me'eruv Shabbos. But if it was obvious that it was going to fall down already from Erev Shabbos, Aser la'achar shenistar, then it becomes Aser once it falls down. V'hem safek im nistar me'erev Shabbos oliloi. If you have a suffix, if the Erev fell down from before Shabbos or not, Ozlina Lekula, we go Lekula and we figure that it fell down on Shabbos, and since it's mukaf chayma, it remains mutter to carry. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Lam Dalit, Oimid Lisaser, and he brings down something which unfortunately a lot of communities deal with nowadays. Mishnah Berurah says, what does it mean that it was Oimid Lisaser? Does it mean that it was a poorly made Erev? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Kigoin. They dealt with this back then too. There are nasty Einam Yehudim who know what those strings are for. I dealt with this in my community in one area where there was some nasty Einam Yehudim who they knew what that string was for, and they bedafka go ahead and they cut it before Shabbos to ruin the Erev. The Karav Levade Hu Sheyikalkalu. Baruch Hashem, in my area at least, the ones who put an end to it were actually Einam Yehudim. Einam Yehudim made noise and slapped down the other Einam Yehudim who were doing this. If you have a proper Erev that was not Oimid Lisaser, and now it fell down in an Ir Mukaf Chayma, you want to know when it fell down. Did it fall down on Shabbos? If it fell down on Shabbos, Shabbos gave it Hutra. If it fell down before Shabbos, you have a problem. You have a suffix. So then it's Lida Lakula, the Mekmina Lachas Kase, because then we'll go with the Chazaka. We assume that it was up. Vahashtahu din Ishbar. Going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sivches. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua Sefurus Panas et Shaduchim Tol Lo Zinid. We should be Zaychet to see the Bias Kel Tzedek. B'mherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.